Secondly, there was a meeting that happened a week ago in Point Grey regarding the Jericho lands. And the statements made at that time that, in the forum, that the federal government is ready to transfer those lands at full market value to the Canada Lands Company for development. So my question is, what role has the city played in this to date? Are we actively talking with the federal government, the Canada Lands Company around this, or is this a preliminary move on their part? How have we engaged the citizens? We have a West Point Grey community vision that was passed by this council in 2010 with some very clear and strong language around development in that neighborhood. So what is our plan going forward to engage with the citizens and make sure that whatever happens there is commensurate with the community vision?
Madam City Manager.
Thanks, Mr. Mayor and Council. Councillor Carr, the federal government, when they make a decision to dispose of a land asset, go through a process of notifying various levels of government. So we have been advised, this has been going on for upwards of nearly 4 years, that the federal government was looking at disposing of the Department of National Defence lands down at Jericho. Their process is very prolonged. They come and talk to us. We share with them usually what the planning framework is for any piece of land that they're thinking of disposing. But they have a very clear process that we have no control over. They often want to know if we have an interest in the lands, but their goal is to achieve highest and best use and the best possible market value. So their process is to make their decision about whether or not they're going to dispose of the lands, whether or not they wish to put any constraints on how those lands might be used. And then they are moved over into the purview of Canada Lands, whose job is basically their real estate development company for the federal government. And then they will, I assume, put out an RFP for the sale of the lands. There are obviously First Nations accommodation discussions that are almost certainly going on around that. And for the city, we know the planning framework that we have. We've shared that with the federal government because that allows them to understand the value. We will track any marketing of these lands and have a look at that. And then whoever purchases the lands, it will be their role of the city. They will then be outside, it's likely, of a government entity. And likely it won't be a Crown entity that purchases the land. So the city will work with them as any other property owner if they wish to develop the lands. So that's the time, it's at that time that community consultation would be part of our normal process.
And that would be when we would be engaging with citizens and informing whoever purchases them at that time of the community vision and that kind of thing?
Well, normally our process with either level of government is if they're selling, especially a large block of land, we make sure that in the RFP that any proponent who's looking at the RFP really understands all the zoning bylaws that apply, any of the policies of council that apply, so that they go into a real estate competition with their eyes fully wide open, so they don't come back to us and say, oh, well, I wanted to build this or that on the site and, I need everything adjusted. So at the end of the day, if we make them aware of the current zoning restrictions that in any ODP, and that creates the value framework for the purchase.
Right, so we will be supplying that. That's wonderful. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Councillor Carr. And next, Councillor Reimer, you have a little bit of time left on your 5 minutes of new business.
On Jericho, and I'm glad Councillor Carr mentioned that. It was a bit disappointing that the MP chose to hold the meeting on a night when we had public hearing, which was well published. I know they had invited me to come and speak to it, and obviously my duties here come first. But to say that in the West Point Grey Plan there is actually not clear direction for this piece of land. It very clearly says for future planning. And I raise that because this is exactly what the challenge is of when we do community planning and have these future planning areas. So a cautionary tale and why we've been pushing hard to get, as much as possible expectations on the table so that we don't end up in these more challenging position. And to thank, I know staff have been working hard to try and make sure, I think most critically, that First Nations are consulted at the outset, because the worst possible outcome is that, Canada Lands Corporation takes the land, and then there's a long process, and then First Nations is consulted at the end, which would be inappropriate, and from previous experience on these matters could easily lead to court cases and a lot of challenges for the local community. So to say that this process of Canada Lands Corporation consulting with First Nations is a good thing, and we need to let it take the time it needs to take.
Okay, thanks, Councillor Reimer. Councillor